Hi everyone, my name is Nairobi and I am the host of Power to the Flower podcast, a new show dedicated to understanding cannabis policy and its impacts to communities of color. The episode today is called Power to the People because while this is the first introductory episode where you'll learn about me and you'll learn about the topics we'll be talking about, I also want to be able to encourage you to learn a little bit more about your own power in this process about policy making and legislating. We get to elect the legislators who create policy, and we get to talk to regulators who regulate. So it's really important for us to utilize our access for the common good. With this podcast, the whole purpose is to educate. The whole purpose is to also uplift others in this industry that are doing it in a way that really benefits each other and the way that really benefits the community as a whole. I also want this podcast to serve as a community resource, something that you may have heard on this podcast that may have only come from here, or maybe something that you were listening that really applied to you that you want to hear more of or you want to talk more of. I want this to be that resource for you, somewhere where you could reference back to points, facts, and figures, things that you learned, and just be able to share that to continue discussions about how we can shape policy. Know your power. That's all I really want. I want this power to go back to the people. While we're talking about the flower, the plant, the cannabis, the marijuana, all of these different names that we have for ganja. Sorry, I had to sip my tea. While we're learning about all of these things, I want you to also think about the ways that you can provide advice for someone joining the industry based on what you learn. Because we want so many people to have access to this industry, but very seldom do we ever lend a hand. Do we ever show people how to really actually do it, or how the best ways to get involved are, or when? So feel free to pass this along, share with the general community, because we really need to expand who gets involved in the conversation, and specifically, what is the new identification of a stakeholder in cannabis. Stakeholders are people who are the important ones in a conversation. But when we're really thinking about it, if we're making policy, everyone should be a stakeholder. Whether you're a resident or not able to vote in specific elections, you still should have a say, and your voice should still be represented in policy. I'm a firm believer in that. I have a particular path prior to joining the cannabis industry that led me to this understanding about policy and the impacts of policy towards communities of color. So my background goes like this. I was in high school and I decided to do an internship program with my mayor. And I stayed interning with my mayor's office for almost about 2 years. It was kind of crazy because I never thought that I would ever stay at a place for so long, especially as my first kind of real job. But it was an internship, so I learned a lot. But while I was interning for the mayor at that time in my city, I learned so much about the civic process. There were people, constituents that would come in and talk about issues that may or may not have pertained to the mayor's office, but we still had an obligation to listen. So I learned that elected officials can actually listen to some of our issues and make impacts on those thoughts that they gather from what we're telling them. So it's important that while we come to legislators to change policy, and we come to legislators about policy fixes that we need to see in general, we need to understand not just our power, but to also understand what we're asking for. So while we're talking about policy changes now, currently in different states and different cities, and even on the federal level, we want to be able to also look at, what is it that we really are asking for? What is it that we really need in order to make effective changes that positively impact our communities? So I'm just thinking about communities that have said no to cannabis, but once cannabis federal legalization happens, what is that community going to look like and who is going to be able to participate in that. So we'll be answering some of these questions on this podcast, but we're going to get right into it. Upon me finishing my internship, I went to college and I decided to study political science. So from high school to college, I kind of was like already getting politicized. My mind, the way that I was seeing every aspect of life and how it really pertains to government, I understood very early on we can make a change, we can make an impact if we really know what we're talking about. And most importantly, if we're really involving everyone that's impacted by any change that needs to be made. So, cannabis in my family, especially in Hispanic families, we didn't have the best relationship. Okay. My family was negatively impacted by some of these war on drug policies because of, federal housing and the restrictions of being able to smoke within a federal housing unit or a unit that receives federal housing assistance. Someone that I know in my family was displaced for years. And the reason why they were displaced was because of consumption on property and not being able to then have access to housing that they needed in the first place. And so while you go ahead and say, well, maybe they shouldn't have been smoking if they know the policies and the rules and the regulations. Well, why do people smoke weed now? Why do people always go back to this plant-based medicine? It's because it's medicine. It's because it really is treatment. And for many, many, many years, it has been a source of medicine for our own communities of color. When we're talking about smoking weed in lyrics and we talk about smoking weed in as a form of cultural experience, we know that we see this in different influences in our community. So it has been a plant that has served its purpose as a medicinal use, but for whatever reason, right, aka the war on drugs, we have been more criminalized. And more specifically, Black people. I want to speak to Black people being more criminalized in higher rates than any other ethnicity or any other group, and seeing how the Black community has really needed the resources since forever in this country to actually thrive because they've been stripped away from different things. We want to make sure that we're uplifting this community and also talking about how we can be a part of a larger conversation as a whole. What is it that the Black community has always asked for but has barely ever gotten in any sort of way? Reparations for the harms done into their community in slavery here in the United States. And while there may be Black Latinos or whatever other, intersectionality in race and ethnicity, we do know that the particular, African slave descendants here in this country have had specific barriers to success. And we want to highlight those things based on a policy lens and its impact in cannabis policy and what that has done with stigmatization and how it seeps back into our families, even when we're talking about creating entrepreneurship opportunities here. When we need opportunities to succeed, are they always readily accessible to us? No. But when new industries are created, like the cannabis industry in its legal form, we know that there should be access to opportunities via social equity programming, which really can be anything from technical assistance to creating a business in cannabis, or it could really be directly providing funding to social equity participants who have been impacted by the war on drugs. So whatever the case is, we need to know and understand how we can shape that policy or how we can shape those resources by basically vocalizing and being historically aware of what has happened in the past to our communities and what we can prevent from happening. Because whether you realize it or not, history repeats itself. We want to make sure history doesn't repeat itself negatively with our communities. So this is why I want to be able to bring this podcast to you, so that when we're talking about these issues through the historical lens and in the perspective of a person of color who is the host, I want to be able to ask the right questions. I want to be able to have frank conversations where we're talking about the purpose of why we even have policies that regulate our consumption anyway, right? So while we're considering all of these things and while you're being a participant, I also want you to engage back with me. Let me know. Is there something else that you'd like to hear? Is there something else that we're not talking enough about, but that you really feel needs more attention? There are going to be different topics we talk about, whether it's social consumption, it's a form of licensure, cultivation, also a form of licensing, um, and it could be even just the high incarceration rates. Whatever we're talking about that you feel like needs to be highlighted more, by all means, share your perspective. I would love to hear from you as our listener. And lastly, with my experience in politics, not just through high school or in college, and in my career working for a United States senator, working, in municipal politics and in state politics for organizations. I've also served as a board chair for a political action committee. So I know that there's money in politics and there's also influence that is had when it comes to creating policy based on who's behind supporting different candidates. And I'll talk about all of that on this podcast. But while I'm introducing you to the podcast and to myself, please know that I'm also a dear advocate to the cannabis industry and specifically for people of color who want to make an entry in the space. If there's anything that I want to do more with this is to be able to expand entrance into the industry by talking about the barriers of entry in general to this new cannabis market. So aside from, just the market itself and aside from just the general, the policy pieces, I want to also talk about civics. Civics is how we stay engaged in the political process and how we change things in the political process. So I'll be providing you with some tools because, again, this podcast will be a community resource. I promise you that. So I will want to equip you with some of these tools to be able to advocate. So, for example, if you would like to see changes in legislation, whether it's on a federal level, on a state level, or a local level, I want you to be able to know who to talk to, what to say, how you can reach them, and if they're unreachable, what actions you can take. For example, if you feel that you are so vehemently against a policy that is going to pass anyway, you can take action by doing a protest. You can get and collect signatures to be able to get a ballot initiative going, or you can be able to participate by creating different methods of advocacy through your own means. But definitely education should be at the center, because while we're advocating, we also have to organize our community and get them to also be educated at the same level that we are on issues that they may not be abreast to, but that are directly affecting them. So I will be doing all of that. It's going to be a little bit of a civics 101. You'll know by the end of this podcast how many senators we have in Congress and how many state rep or how many representatives, how many Congress people we have in Congress in the House of Representatives. So you'll learn things like that from me. And you'll also learn a little bit more of the, like I said before, the history behind politics and cannabis. But we want to talk more about data points, the facts and the figures, even though some of these data points can be skewed based on where you live, based on faulty reporting on behalf of, law enforcement, right? We'll see some of that. But one thing you also should know is this. I'm going to be smoking, okay? I be chiefing. I'm going to be chiefing on this podcast. I'm going to smoke with you, okay? You're going to smoke with me if you are over the age of 21. Or 21 and over. Because that is the legal age in Massachusetts. Have you ever thought about mass incarceration? Have you ever thought about who gets to vote? We'll also be talking about disenfranchisement, because you can get a felony for the type of interaction, depending on where you live, for selling cannabis or things like that. And if you may be able to get a felony for your interaction with cannabis, whether it's having it on you or selling it or whatever the case is, consuming it in public properties where it's not allowed. The felony that you receive can also disenfranchise you, meaning take away your right to vote in the state that you live in, depending on their laws for felons who are incarcerated and can't vote. There are 40, I believe it's 48 states that have restrictive policies for people who are incarcerated. Most states won't allow you to vote while you're incarcerated. But some states don't even give you your right to vote after you served your sentence. Some states don't even give you the right to vote even for a lifetime after you've served a sentence. So it really depends. And of those states, I know that there's 12 that are very stringent. They're very strict. And it keeps people out of the process, and it keeps people behind because they won't want to participate in policy, and they won't want to participate in civics because they already feel like they've been excluded from the process, right? So chances are they won't get a voice, but the people that are in pain from policy should be close to that power as well. So we need to find ways to keep people engaged. My suggestion is, if you know someone, still educate them on policy issues that you might know of. You still want to make sure that that person has a voice so they can also help join in protests or anything like that. They can also write letters to their senators, like I had mentioned previously. You can also call a legislator's office. You can talk about the need for expungement. You can talk about the need for sealing of records. You can talk about the need for pardons, which are all different terms and all different, definitions of, or all different versions of, getting rid of cannabis on your record, right? So that you may have more access to opportunities in your life while you're here living in the United States, or even specifically in the city or state that you might live in. So why am I doing this? Simply put, because I can and it's free. But I really, really care about educating the public. I really care about making sure that we have enough resources for our community to be able to make active choices on who they vote for, and why they're voting for people that may have decided against a policy that negatively impact them themselves. So you can take a lot of what we say here in this podcast and apply it to other areas of policy. And you can see that whether or not there is a criminalization piece behind that policy or not, there may be opposing factors to a lot of what we're pushing for. Jefes Jardín is a Hispanic-owned cultivation in CT in Connecticut. Specifically, I think he's based out of Hartford, or maybe he's like more here. He's definitely in Connecticut, been fighting for a social equity license and was not given one. And that is just one of those stories where we can highlight how sometimes the social equity licenses can be not as easy as people would like to think it is. There's a lot that goes into securing a license, more specifically, even getting into some of these programs to be a social equity applicant. You do have to qualify under specific guidelines. And then after those guidelines, you also have to then specifically live in a certain place. It's crazy. So, which is actually a part of the guidelines. But then, you have to go through a process of applying and writing a document as to why you would like to participate. And that's difficult for some people. I'm gonna be real, it's not easy. It's not, I mean, I'm an educated person, fine, I went to college, I did whatever. I love to write. I'm a writer. But like, even for someone like me, you have to have like a lot of mental patience to be able to go through a social equity application and then gather all of the documents for it just to be told if you're qualified or not to participate and get in technical assistance where there I'm sure are people who are denied that probably need it, and I think that that's just one aspect when we're talking about the flaws in the social equity program. That's just immediately going through the application process. Like, imagine somebody who's been selling weed on the streets and who's been involved like in the legacy market, like whatever their past may have been. If they were in the legacy market and they've been doing the shit, like, why is it that there's got to be such a stringent process just to go through to get accepted into a program? And then not only that, to specifically wait a very long time to be able to get into the program. And then once you're in it, you're like, you kind of have to make the best of the time that you have in order to finish it. So there are certain things. It's helpful, and I think that like we should always be appreciative of the program assistance that's there that could be flexible for certain families. But I'm gonna be real, like, it doesn't work for everybody, and not always does the completion of that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna get a license. It just means that you're a social equity applicant now, right? And so you still have to go through a process, and then they have to approve you and make sure that all of your documentation is straight. And like, you got to go through inspections, and but did I even talk about fundraising? You know what I'm saying? So like, someone like, this business, or like even my own, you got to think about what those pitfalls can be as an entrepreneur of color in this space. And that's not even mentioning, right, like who even gets access to that, because then that's on the state level. Then when you're thinking about the local level and getting local approval and going through like a host community agreement, which is basically a document that says you as the cannabis business, could like you as the cannabis business could function in that city. It basically is an agreement between you and them as your partnership or whatever, and it comes down to fees, and then there's a percentage. And there have been now some recent changes on the state government side with regards to host community agreements. But even so, like, just understanding that process, like, there's so much to really kind of consume, you know what I'm saying? And so yeah. I'm just telling one side of the story. But, there's so many different aspects to it. But like, I do have to say it's good to like know, your regulators. It's good to know who your legislators are, because, they will really be helpful in the process for you to understand the process itself. You have to kind of find your allies, and also be a good friend to like folks in this that work in the CCC, just because you need to know, or whatever your governing body is called. I think in Jersey is the CRCC, something like that. But we were talking about Jersey, we said Connecticut. So there's different commissions, right? And things like that. Side tangent. But no, I'm just really excited just in general to talk about cannabis, to talk about the aspects of which, cannabis policy really does affect people on a minuscule level, right? This was just a side story about like being an entrepreneur in the legal space and some of the barriers to entry. But that's not even like the whole thing of it, And then there are people who want to get into the space but just like don't know how. And there's not really like free legal resources or free resources on that front to kind of participate in that. And because of the, federal illegality, I guess you could say straight up, about weed, it also makes it a tricky space because you can't have access to, bank loans or anything like that. And if you do, then you have to be of a certain, your business has to be at a certain level of funds to be able to tap into that. So like, And on top of that, you have to be like operational for some of these banks that do issue out loans. But, it's because it's a high risk, well, at least to banks, it's high risk of an investment because, they have such specific portfolios um, that they can take on. And then you're kind of like, okay, if they are taking on, someone like me who's a social equity applicant, or if they're taking someone like that's a big multi-state operation, they have to then adjust for all of their customers, and their services have to match with what they're able to give. And despite what people may say, it is so risky because then it's like, it's a highly regulated industry. So on the legal aspect, it's so highly regulated that for people who've been operating in legacy for so long, like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense as to why it's so overregulated, other than the fact that here's another barrier where I'm trying to make money off of this thing that I've always made money on, but now I got a whole different ball game of like how I operate. So needless to say, it's not easy for someone who has gone legacy or who's been legacy for so long and like wants to go legal. But it is possible. There have been success stories, and we're seeing that with a lot of folks. I mean, I'm happy to see, folks in New York, like shout out to Happy Monkey, who like, they just got recently awarded their card license, and that card license is basically a license that's allotted to social equity applicants, or applicants in general, but like the social equity applicants get it first. They get like, it was a really good process where New York tried to really be thoughtful about who got it and when, and folks who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, or people who have been like, a part of the legacy market, and like they got a story, they've been arrested, they like, like those people have been prioritized, and that's what we want to see. That's what we need to see. That is what it needs to be shown. And sorry I keep clapping, but like, damn, round of applause. So, we have to think about, when we're looking at policy in general, who makes this policy and who tells us like what we can and cannot do with something that we have in our communities have had long-standing relationships with this plant. And then like you're gonna think about, okay, what will this do for people who are really actually trying but are still confronted with those constant barriers, whether it's fundraising, you could still raise funds, but you have to consider how much of your business you need to sacrifice in order to get yourself to a place where you comfortably, can have an operational business. So, thinking about things like that, or if you're an MSO, which is a multi-state operation, you're operating with interstate kind of confusion, right? Like, you're looking at it from a lens of like, okay, we are large, but there is also so many different legal issues in each state that we have to adhere to. And so then there's a different shaping of culture. So how do you acknowledge, the ways in which you treat employees in one state more than, how you also treat employees in another? So lots to consider there. And again, a lot of it, I think if you're in the industry and you've heard already, like through different conversations, or you've like gleaned a lot of like, conversations from regulators and things like that, that they talk to each other. A lot of it is interstate conversations. So where there are similarities in how we regulate in Massachusetts, in New York, there's also differences, because they might even be having conversations about what did or didn't work, or what might work in one state versus the other, just because of culture. And, not even just culture, but, data, on facts and figures that need to shape policy. But, when we're thinking about us, and who gets to participate in those conversations, we are the ones that get to say, we want this way. We want policy to be benefiting, people who've been impacted by the war on drugs, or we want people who have been, unfairly, like, racially biased for having, cannabis on them. Like, I don't know how you would quantify that, but like things like that, like stories, like how you would say we would give preference to someone's application to another, or give access to resources and things like that. Um, all of those things, we are the ones that get the say in that, but we have to be strategic and know how to do so. And so, whether you're someone who wants to participate in the industry and doesn't really know how, or someone who's been in the industry but don't really get involved in the weeds of it. There's ways to get involved, and there's ways to talk to your legislators as well as the regulators, and even, nonprofits. I used to work for Mass Cultivated, and Mass Cultivated also does advocacy stuff, and other organizations like Mass Eon, especially shout out to Mass Eon, who does amazing work on the advocacy front. I just think overall, like, there are unique organizations that really have been you know trying to shape policy, as well as like shaping the landscape and filling a void where there hasn't been really any resources allotted to by like legislation. So like those are the different support services where you see that kind of like in every industry, whether it's like, the healthcare industry, and then there's like community health centers that are filling a gap that hospitals aren't. Like, there are ways in which we look at policy, and we have to understand also the stakeholders, but most importantly, acknowledging like we ourselves are those stakeholders. You are a stakeholder. You're someone who, if you're listening to this podcast, now you're knowing a little bit about who's involved, and you could easily just reach out to those people as well. But also, like, talking about who gets to vote, we want to make sure we highlight disenfranchisement in certain states. And, there are states that don't allow for folks who are incarcerated to vote during an election year, but that election year may be the most, consequential to their sentencing or reforms that could impact them, right? And it could be that because they sold marijuana or they sold cannabis on the streets, or they were in an illicit market, participating in the legacy market. It becomes a sort of a setback for those people, because now you're keeping them out of the conversation, and there's nobody really participating or being that voice for them, other than organizations that could be doing, prison advocacy work. So needless to say, I think we should all sort of acknowledge our power. Okay, so while we're, thankful that we have all of these different know-hows and policies that are shaping for us, we also have to sort of talk about how we can shape policy for the community as a whole. And that really is through education. We have to be educated based on data. And a lot of what this podcast will be doing will be educating and pushing conversations forward, at least highlighting things that we didn't necessarily think about in a policy conversation, and maybe even just discussing a little bit more ways that we can accomplish that. So while we're having these conversations about issues, having real live conversations where there's conclusions and solutions, where we're thinking about how do we find and solve this? Like, we're also talking about the method and how to do so. So stay tuned. I'm excited to bring you more. I'm excited to continue the conversation. But as always, if you have something that you like to add and something that you'd love to see a little bit more of, conversations that you would like to hear, please message me. You probably know where to find us. On Instagram is at Power to the Flower Pod. And you can reach me at my personal if anything. But this is really great. I'm excited to keep talking. But peace. Tick, tick.